Okay, today's class is going to be a little bit different. We're going to talk about a different model for doing database-driven pages in ASP.NET Core. Because there's a lot of flavors of ASP.NET there, and again, you I think covered them in your first homework assignment when we talked about web forms, which I assume is still part of the language, even though it's kind of an older format. And what we're doing, which is Razor pages. And we're using Razor pages within a certain design pattern. And we'll talk about that in a minute. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So we'll cover this today, and then we'll see what there is to go over the next 2 weeks of class. This is week 13. Next week is week 14, week 15, and then projects are due. Projects are certainly one of your most important things in this class. Just look at the value of points for the project and know that it's something you should spend time focusing on. And again, strive to make whatever you do it well, and not just be a place where you can enter and retrieve data, but somehow that you can transform the data into information, into a more usable form. All right. I mentioned that this is a different design pattern. So what in the world is a design pattern? Well, a design pattern is not actually code. It's sort of a concept, sort of a template for a concept. Typical solutions to common problems in software design. It's a blueprint that you can customize to solve a particular design problem with your code. So, if we were to take a history lesson and go back throughout the annals of computer programming, in the early days, it was in a way kind of like the Wild West, all right? You had developers doing their own thing and coming up with solutions to problems. And there wouldn't be sort of any level of consistency to their solutions. In other words, one developer might do things one way, another developer might do something some other way. So even though problems are unique, if you work at, I've worked at a car rental company, I worked at a couple car rental companies, I worked at a software development company that dealt in the food industry. I worked at a consulting company that did all kinds of projects. And the interesting thing is, although I work in really different places, there's a lot of common ground between the problems that you solve in programming. So yes, each solution has to be made specific to an organization and its problems. But there's definitely some patterns and some structures that cross over between these different solutions. And so to gain some of these consistencies, common language that helps your team communicate more efficiently is a toolkit for solving these problems. So not each problem is started from scratch at ground zero. You can build up a solution to a problem based on a certain framework. There's a little bit about the history and criticism. Always with any kind of technology, you're going to find some drawbacks to it, in addition to some benefits for it. So that is, in a nutshell, what the design patterns are. There's some example of design patterns as well. A builder separates object construction from its representation. Factory, object pool, prototype, a singleton, and so on down the line. Chain of responsibility, a way of passing a request between a chain of objects. An iterator, to sequentially access the elements of a collection. Somewhere in here was an adapter. to sort of match up two classes and get them talking to each other. So there's a whole bunch of these. And one of them that exists is what's called the MVC, or Model View Controller. All right. Let's first talk about what we've used, because we've used this we have used something really close to Models View Controller, but we've used actually a variation of that called Model View Model. All right. Or no. Yeah, Model View Model. Let me Google that because I'm getting tongue-tied here. Model View Model. I did say it right. It didn't sound right when I said that. It just was like I said model and view like 2 times, but they're like grouped together: model, view, and view model. If you think about the structure of our code, maybe a sketch would be good here. We have our models, which represent entities in our solution. So let's say, for instance, we have, for one of your assignments, you have a meals. Meals as an entity, and there might be other entities related to that, like there might be a category, note, and so on. That's the model. The model is what the data is. It's a representation of the data for that entity, and it controls the retrieval and updating of the database, because that's how we do updating of the databases, via the classes in the model. Now, the view is what the user sees. So in the meals directory, there's an index, which is a list. There's a create. There's an edit. There's a delete. And there are details. So this is what we get when we scaffold. We get these 5 different views associated with an entity. Now, there's something in between these to allow them to talk to each other. That's sort of, I don't know if we want to say the boss or the go-between or the bridge, and that is the view model. And these end in CSS_HTML, and these end in .cshtml.cs. And there's one of these per view. I'll draw them all, but I won't fill them in because I have a hard time writing vertically. But it's sort of the go-between between the model and the view. So therefore, they gave the name of view model. So in the manner that we've been doing, which was model, view model, MVVM, this is what it looks like. For every view or CSS_HTML page, we have sometimes I've called it the code behind. We have the view model for it. And then we have our model, which is a representation of the data, the class, and the stuff that's in the class. In IT and in development, when you can separate things into pieces, that's a good way to deal with a problem. So in this case, we have the data, the way the user sees it, and sort of the glue between these two. There's a connection. That's separated into discrete pieces. In other words, the way that the data is stored is not tied up with the way that it's presented to the user. All right. Compared to the old days when you just had a model or a program rather, there was just a big chunk of code. All right, a big chunk of code that did probably all of this. All right, it's much harder to write and debug, and this lends itself to quick development, code that is easily modified, and so on. So, for example, if we want to change the way that the view looks, we just change this. All right. We probably don't have to touch this unless we're adding new fields to the model. And we might have to touch this or might not, depending on the extent of the change. All right. There's definitely places to do each of these, and each of these is a discrete function, and the total of the system is separated between these layers. They used to call these a tiered model, a 3-tiered model or whatever. Well, the same thing. We have the data, you have the code, and then you have the way it's presented to the user. So I'm going to save this because I might want to come back to this. Save it on the desktop, and I'll call it MVVM. Now let's talk about the model view controller. We're going to see some of the same things, but we don't have a view model for every view. We have our model. And we have our views. So on. We might have those same 5 views. Instead of having a view model that is specific to the page, we have a controller that is specific to an entity. So the model looks like this. I'm going to save these and put these side by side on the screen. So if we're going to look at this, essentially, the model's the same in both. The views are the same. What's different is this what would you call it? The glue entity, the thing that brings these two things together and sort of wires them together so that they can work together, that can retrieve the data from the model and can use it to populate the view. In the case of what we've been doing, model view, view model, we have one of these per page. Here we have one of these controllers per entity. Oh, I can't write on that. That thing in the middle is a controller. So that thing in the middle is like all these view models for this entity put into one class. And that's really the difference, is where is the glue between the view and the controller, or the view and the model? Is it in a separate file for each view, or is there one file per entity that's called the controller that glues the model entity, the entity model, to the view? So that's what model view controller is in a nutshell. We have a resource on this. And again, I'm just sort of breezing through these. Please take the time on your own to go and read these in more detail. And it talks about what is model view architectural design pattern. It separates application into three components: the model, the view, and the controller. There's a person that invented it. Separation between the business logic, UI logic, and input logic. Model handles the data object, or data logic, and interacts with the database. That's what our models have been doing. We haven't had so much data logic in there. We had some minor data logic in the Contoso University thing, where it takes names and adds them together to come up with a full name. That's a small little piece of logic. You could have more extensive logic as well if you needed it. The view handles the presentation, and the controller is sort of the glue between these. Fetches the data from that, gives it to the presentation, and sort of handles the flow of things, which is pretty much what MVVM does, except there's one of these per view instead of one per entity. Let's look up. Same idea, right? The only thing that this diagram doesn't show is that there's one of these per view as opposed to one per model. You can learn everything about it in 100 seconds. Wow. Here, and I'm lecturing how long about this? 40 minutes, 50 minutes? It's a little simpler than model view controller. Easier to test and easier to maintain. So, what are your choices when you're creating an ASP.NET Core web app? Well, first of all, this is just ASP.NET Core. If you want to go back, there's actually web forms. Are web forms still being used? And the short answer is no. So web forms are dying. So that's what we're not going to talk about it anymore. All right. So you can continue to run them, but it's doubtful that a lot of new development will be done in them. So most of ASP.NET development is going on in the core world, where there are Blazor pages, Razor pages. I'm not making this up. This is someone else made this up. MVC. So this is the MVVM. This is the MVC. And then single page applications with front end JavaScript formats. So we're really interested in these two. There's a brief overview of Blazor, and this is what we've been doing with Razor pages. Shows the advantages: quick build and update. Code is kept with the page while keeping the UI and business logic separate. Testable. These are all the things the other one pretty much said. MVC is sort of an older format. There's a much clearer separation of concerns for maximum flexibility, and ensures that the business model can evolve without being tightly coupled to low-level implementation details. All right, so where does that leave us? That leaves us with your last homework assignment. I knew if I put it that way, that would be an encouraging way to look at it. And your last homework assignment is relatively easy because you're simply going to do the same tutorial that we did at the beginning of the semester for Razor Pages and the model view model paradigm design pattern, but you're going to do it for model view controller. So I might work through some of this, but I don't want to have all the fun. I don't want to spoil you guys' fun, so I probably won't do all of it. I'll probably just do portions of it. So here we go. Close everything else so I'm not distracted. All right, there's a later version of this with .NET 8. I think most of you have .NET 6. So let's go and do this. So we create the same thing, except we say create using ASP.NET Core Web App using Model View Controller. So let's go into Visual Studio. And let's create a new project. There's all the different kinds of projects that you can create. This is the one that we've been doing using Razor Pages. I believe if we look, yeah, right here, we're going to use a model view controller design pattern in this one. So I click next. Where's the location? I'll put it on the desktop. I won't be lazy and call it Web Application 1 because that always drives me crazy when students do it. And I'll call it MVC tutorial. Next. Any authentication? For this simple one, we're not going to have any authentication. You can probably guess what this is. I did want to go over this mainly because if you are in an environment that uses MVC, there's a lot of skills that you learned with the MVVM design pattern that are applicable here. Some of this stuff is going to look awful familiar to you. All right. But there is a little bit different. So I at least wanted to introduce you to this model just in case you were to run into this in the real world. All right, so we create. Looks familiar, huh? One difference, it already has populated a models folder and a controller folder and a view folder. Some of the names are a little different. So we created that. We run the app. And we get this stuff again. This is not recommended to do on your machine. There are other workarounds for this. Save that and try this again. Swell. Oh, you know what? There is more than one way to skin the hypothetical cat. We'll try another browser, see if another browser is. I'm going to paste that URL into Chrome. And of course, it doesn't have any problem with that as well. All right, so looks familiar, eh? All right, pretty much what we had done before. All right, so our next thing to do, add a controller. So in MVC, the view only displays information, the controller handles and responds to user input and interactions, and so on. So I'm going to add a controller. So in the controller, I'm going to right mouse. I'm going to add a controller. And see what they want us to do here. Add controller, make it empty, and call it Hello World Controller. Where do we put the name in? Oh, here. Hello World. Font is small. Controller. All right, so here we have. And notice what we have. We have an index. What is that index like? That index is like the index.cshtml, or this is returning a view. This is the index is like the index part of the controller, or the index page controller or view controller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in here a method for index. So this would be like getting the index or list of things. This will be a welcome page. So I'm going to go and run this. Copy it in the edge. Now it wants us to run there we go. It wants us to run append hello world to the path. So what is hello world? That is the name of my controller. So if I go and add here on the end of the controller / hello world, what do you think is going to happen? Well, it is going to direct to the index part of the controller called hello world. So it's going to get that. Because if you don't specify a more specific action, it defaults to index. So this is my default action. All right. And if I put, what was the other one? Greeting or welcome. And if I put welcome, that's calling the welcome method in the hello world controller. This is the welcome action method. So we're calling things in the controller by putting this in. Now this is set in the program.cs file. So if we stop debugging, and look at the program.cs, this is explaining by default it's index with an optional ID and whatever controller we're using. That's what controls that. Now, we can put that in welcome. And optional string is name, optional number of times defaults to 1, and we can put in number of times. So just missed a step. We can fix it by adding that. And we can add on the query string, this, and it shows me, hello, Rick, number of times is 4. And then I can, they go on to put code in there to do a loop and so on. Now we can add a view. And a view could be or will be a CSS_HTML page. So we right click on the view folder. Add a folder. Add a new item. We'll call it index.cshtml. Index.cshtml, we add it. And there we have it. It's a very basic, empty web page, but we can put stuff in it. You want us to put that in the view? And then when we run this, okay, I did something wrong because it's still displaying that. I think we have to say return view. I fear I missed something here. Is that what I have? Oh. I have the wrong return type. So that's going to call a view of the same name, index, in the hello world folder. And there we go, MVC tutorial, hello from our view template. So you see this is sort of a different way to glue together the model and we haven't created a model yet, but the view and the controller. As we continue through this example, and I won't do all this because, again, I want you to explore this on your own. We're going to make the views more complex. Just like with Razor Pages, there is a layout page that gives us part of the page. We can pass data from the controller. And eventually we can tie it to a model and scaffold the movie pages. But we don't lose our scaffolding, thank goodness. All right. But again, work through this on your own. Let me know if you're running into any difficulties. It shouldn't be too difficult. It's just a matter of following step by step. All right. Are there any questions at this point? Yes. Does all the scaffolding go into one file? I believe the controller it creates would be, let's look to find out for sure. I don't want to misspeak. I believe it would create everything into one controller and separate views. I just don't want to talk out of turn here. So at MVC controller with views, right? So it would update, it would create a new controller and it would generate the views for it. So yes, it puts all the stuff in a controller and in the one controller, and it creates separate views for the different pieces of functionality that entity would have. Anything else? All right, that's all I had for today. We'll either see you in lab or we will see you next week. I keep tuned to Canvas. My inclination right now is to just extend office hours during the lecture time and have you check in with me as far as how your project is going and any of your other difficulties. But I will post to Canvas, so be aware about that. That should be coming within the next several days, definitely by the beginning of next week. All right, we'll see you next week. Have a good Thanksgiving.